99% of you watching this video have never witnessed the horrors of the Holocaust. But if you want to understand what such cruelty looks like today, then turn your eyes to Syria. Syrian jails are now a living example of a modern mini-Holocaust. The Nazis didn't just commit atrocities, they taught their methods of interrogation and torture. And those techniques were still being used until last week. The picture you see was taken just a few days ago inside a Syrian prison cell. And next to it is a photograph from the Auschwitz concentration camp during the Nazi era. The resemblance is haunting. So far, it's estimated that over 17,000 people, men, women, and children, were tortured and left to die in conditions that you can't even imagine. But that's just the start. Between 2011 and 2015, one survivor described how every single week, sometimes twice a week, groups of up to 50 people were taken away in the middle of the night and never to be seen again. It's estimated that in those 5 years, over 13,000 additional civilians were hanged to death. In the middle of the night, under the cover of total secrecy, guards at Sednaya prison would call out the names of detainees, claiming that they were being transferred to civilian prisons. But it was all a lie. Instead, the prisoners were blindfolded and taken to a basement cell where they were beaten so severely they could barely stand. And then, still blindfolded, they would be moved to a bottom floor where the hangings took place. Throughout this process, the detainees had no idea what was happening. They didn't know when or how they would die until the noose was placed around their necks. Still, for some, death didn't come quickly. Due to their lightweight body, they'd end up suffocating for 10 to 15 agonizing minutes. And when that wasn't enough, the guards would pull them down and break their necks. Those imprisoned on the floor above the execution chamber lived through a unique kind of hell, because they could hear it all. By pressing their ears to the floor, they could hear the sickening, gurgling sounds of the hangings below. Imagine the terror of living there, night after night, listening to those awful sounds and knowing that one day, it would be you. Be aware. In this video, we're about to talk about just how dark and disturbing some parts of humanity can be. If this feels like too much to handle, I don't blame you, and you can skip to these timestamps for another part of the discussion. But for those who choose to listen, it's crucial that we confront this reality together. It's heartbreaking that even now, the world and mainstream media have largely ignored the inhumane and brutal atrocities that occurred in Syrian prisons. And even now, speaking about this topic comes with risks. We don't know how YouTube's algorithm will respond to this kind of content, and that's why we're asking for your help. Please, like this video, leave a comment, subscribe, share it with others before it potentially gets taken down. Every bit of support makes a difference and helps keep these stories alive. All right, with that said, let's get started. When we say mini-Holocaust, we mean it, literally. There are undeniable links between Nazi methods and the horrors in Syria. In fact, former Syrian President Hafez al-Assad literally hired Alois Brunner, one of the world's most wanted Nazi war criminals, to train his authorities. Brunner wasn't an ordinary war criminal. He was responsible for the deportation of over 128,000 Jews to Nazi death camps. Brunner was often described as the architect of the final solution, and one of Hitler's best men because he played a key role in the implementation of Hitler's idea to murder Jews. Similarly, under Assad's orders, Brunner brought Nazi torture techniques to Syria. He helped design prisons so brutal that they could drive people to suicide. He orchestrated methods of systematic torture, mass executions, countless rapes, and psychological destruction that left countless Syrians dead, broken, or forever scarred. But how did he get to Syria? You see, after Nazi Germany surrendered, many Nazi officials were brought to justice, but others, like Alois Brunner, managed to flee. Using false identities, Brunner managed to find asylum in Syria. At one point, authorities controlling northern Syria arrested him, suspecting he was a spy. When interrogated, he confessed his true identity and revealed that he was being hunted down because he was an enemy of the Jews. Ironically, these authorities harbored similar anti-Semitic views. From that moment, Brunner became an advisor to Syrian intelligence on German affairs, even recruiting several of his former Nazi colleagues to join him. But Brunner's role was far beyond advising. He also became an instructor and taught Nazi torture and interrogation methods to Syrian officers. Every day, he traveled to the outskirts of Damascus to conduct these lessons, passing on the Gestapo's techniques and ideology. He didn't just teach physical cruelty, but also psychological systems designed to dehumanize victims and break them entirely. By the late 1960s, Brunner was openly living in Damascus under the protection of the Syrian regime. Some of the country's future intelligence leaders, such as General Ali Duba, who led Syria's military security service from 1973 to 2000, were reportedly Brunner's protégés. Clearly, his teachings were becoming a reality. His methods stripped individuals of their humanity, turning them into tools for torture and oppression. This brutal legacy shaped Syrian intelligence for decades. But funny enough, it wasn't Israel or the United States who punished Brunner. Instead, it was the very same Syrian regime who he served so loyally. Even throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Syrian government continued to protect Brunner, dismissing extradition requests from Austria, West Germany, and the United States with the standard claim that no such person exists in Syria. But Brunner's presence became a growing embarrassment for the regime, especially due to media campaigns led by Nazi hunters Serge and Beat Klarsfeld. They drew international attention to Brunner's crimes and his life of impunity in Syria. Testimonies from his guards revealed that Brunner's freedom was gradually reduced, especially after he disobeyed a direct order from President Hafez al-Assad to avoid publicity. Despite the regime's instructions, Brunner gave repeated interviews to German, Austrian, and international media, drawing unwanted attention. By 1996, Assad decided enough was enough. By now, Brunner had long outlived his usefulness. So he was removed from his apartment and jailed indefinitely in an underground cell beneath the Muhajirun police station. According to a guard's testimony, the door was closed and never opened again. Brunner's final years were marked by misery and humiliation. His jailers were ordered not to kill him outright, but also not to keep him alive comfortably. They tormented him by offering a daily choice between a hard-boiled egg and a tomato for his meal. Brunner eventually died in 2001, alone in his cell. His body was secretly removed and buried in a Muslim cemetery. Still, many argue that his death was far more merciful than the suffering he caused for countless Jewish and Syrian victims. Just a few days ago, after the main rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham overthrew the Syrian government, their first action wasn't to celebrate. Instead, they rushed to a notorious prison on the outskirts of the capital. This is Sednaya prison, also known as the human slaughterhouse. They rushed because they knew what the regime hid there. Inside were thousands of political detainees, activists, and ordinary people. Some caught at the wrong place at the wrong time, others for no reason at all. Many had vanished without a trace, leaving families with nothing but unanswered questions. As news spread that Sednaya's gates were being forced open, thousands of civilians gathered, following the rebels. Some hoped to find their brothers or fathers who had disappeared years ago. Others searched for sisters or friends who had dared to speak out. The crowd filled the road and fields nearby. They waited, holding old photographs and calling out names, praying for an answer. Any answer. When the rebels broke into the prison, they weren't ready for what they found. The halls were caked in filth and blood. Bodies were stacked in cells, some alive, most not. Death lingered in every corner, and the stench spoke of starvation and torture. The rebels were not ready for the scale of it. Nobody was. They searched cell after cell, calling out names and trying to match faces to the missing. But many prisoners couldn't speak. Some flinched at the sight of other humans, terrified of what might come next. Others were so weak they looked like skeletons, barely able to stand. Many had to be convinced to leave, unable to believe they were truly free. And then there were those who said nothing at all, too broken to respond. Still, the rebels kept searching, digging through the grounds, and breaking down walls to find hidden cells. Outside, families waited, desperate for answers. Some tried to form lists, writing down names of the found and the dead. But it was chaos, and soon the crowd began to push forward as they had to see for themselves. Rebel fighters fired rounds into the air to hold them back, but nothing worked. In the next couple of minutes, the general public learned why this prison had earned its nickname as the human slaughterhouse. Amnesty International reported that the prison had two main detention centers, the Red Building and the White Building. Each was designed to hold between 10 to 20,000 people. The Red Building housed civilians, many arrested since the start of the Civil War in 2011. The White Building detained military personnel suspected of disloyalty to the regime. Within these centers, 3 wings operated with chilling precision, each specializing in different forms of torture. One of the buildings had a haunting design. At its center was a circular hub from which 3 long, straight corridors extended like spokes on a wheel. The building went 5 stories underground, and the only way down was a spiral staircase. This staircase was surrounded on all sides by metal bars, creating an eerie, cage-like descent. From the ground floor, the stairs seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. When people rushed in, they entered from different doors only to find themselves back at the center, lost in the maze. Even the rebels couldn't figure out how to navigate the place. It was disorienting by design. Finally, one person found a map and pieced together a way to start looking for prisoners. This goes to show the way the interiors of the prisons were designed. Even if the guards weren't cruel enough, then the prison itself would act as a tool of oppression that would drive anyone suicidal. Cells were narrow, just a few meters wide, and overcrowded. More than a dozen prisoners were forced into spaces so small that there was no room to lie down. Some walls had jagged holes where additional prisoners had been crammed. The air was thick and suffocating with no proper ventilation. The walls were soundproof and sunlight never reached them. For the people inside, it was a living nightmare, a place meant to erase humanity left in their souls. Before moving forward, I want to share that I'm tired of seeing ads everywhere I go. I mean, how many ads has YouTube shown you on this video alone? That's why we launched a newsletter a few years ago called Global Recaps. We've been sending daily news right to you with no ads. Yeah, that's right. We have sent 2,500 newsletters, but not one of them has contained an ad. So if you want global news with no ads and no censorship, then this is the solution for you. Sign up now by scanning the QR code on the screen or link in the description. Sign up today and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. That was quite a change in tone. So, in 2016, an artist and audio investigator interviewed former prisoners of Sednaya. The thing is, since the 2011 uprising, Sednaya has been sealed off from the world. No journalists, independent observers, or victims' families were allowed inside. The only way to learn about the mass murders and tortures that took place was to speak with the very few who were lucky enough to survive and were later released. According to some of these victims, Syrian authorities would throw prisoners into tiny, dark cells, blindfold them, and force them to face the wall whenever the guards were present. Over time, prisoners developed an acute sensitivity to sound. Guards were so cruel that making any sound, be it speaking, coughing, or even shuffling, meant risking death. Even during brutal beatings, prisoners were expected to remain silent. Thousands who couldn't suppress their cries were executed. Hearing became a tool for survival. Identifying where guards were at all times was crucial. Prisoners would memorize the metallic tong of boots descending the spiral staircase, the distinct sound of each cell door's lock, or the whispers of names called during roll calls for execution. They even counted how many prisoners were brought in, listening carefully to every detail. These sounds weren't just a survival mechanism, they would later help survivors piece together Sednaya's story for the world. One witness also said that one of the loudest sounds, aside from the horrendous torture noises, was the killing of lice. For those who don't get it, try crushing a sesame seed between your fingers and hear the tiny pop sound it makes. Imagine enduring so much torment that the loudest thing in your environment is the sound of killing lice. Another survivor recalled a moment of bittersweet joy, the sound of bread slapping the floor outside his cell. For him, that sound meant survival, enough food to make it through one more day. He said if he could record that sound, he would make it his ringtone, even play it at his wedding. Don't forget that these words came from a man now living in freedom. Some of the prisoners who were recently freed from Sednaya have asked that the prison not be destroyed. Instead, they want it preserved, left exactly as it is, to serve as a stark and haunting reminder for this generation and for the ones to come. Similarly, human rights groups have urged the preservation of records and ledgers discovered in the prison. These documents contain names of prisoners and could help uncover the fate of the estimated 136,000 people arrested by the Assad regime. Even right now, as you watch this video, thousands of Syrians are still looking towards Sednaya as their last hope of finding missing loved ones. Several more are arriving from across Syria, clinging to the possibility that they might finally learn what happened to the people they've spent years searching for. People are so desperate for answers that they've resorted to digging several fields near Sednaya prison. In 2022, interviews with 4 Syrian men who worked at or near secret mass grave sites led to the discovery of 2 locations, confirmed through satellite imagery. The images showed trenches being dug and later covered over time. Might seem small, but one site alone spanned about 10 acres. For a better understanding, that's about the same as 7 full-size American football fields. During the day, workers used heavy machinery to dig pits and trenches, and by night, bodies arrived, sometimes hundreds at a time, hauled in military pickup trucks or refrigerators meant for food transport. These sites, holding thousands of bodies each, may now serve as some of the most damning evidence of war crimes committed by Bashar al-Assad's regime. Despite these discoveries, the Syrian government has repeatedly and shamelessly denied killing people in detention. Even as far back as 2014, when human rights groups presented overwhelming evidence to the world, the regime continued its denials. At that time, some of the most powerful pieces of evidence came from a former Syrian police photographer known by the codename Caesar. You see, Caesar defected from Syria, taking with him a portable disk drive containing 55,000 photographs of over 10,000 bodies. To this day, no one has done more to expose Assad's brutality than Caesar. Before his defection, Caesar worked for the military police, photographing accident scenes. But after the war began, he and other photographers were assigned to document dozens of corpses daily. He noticed that all corpses showed clear signs of torture and strangulation. Convinced he was witnessing war crimes, Caesar began secretly copying the photos onto thumb drives and smuggling them out of his office. Over 2 years, he built a massive archive of the atrocities, but when asked to train a successor, he became alarmed that the government might be onto him. Taking no chances, he defected, bringing the hard drive with him. His evidence has since become one of the most critical records of the Syrian regime's crimes. There were countless photos of corpses rotting in the sand, ribs protruding over sunken bellies, thighs as thin as wrists and necks, and several broken bones. In 2014, these photographs were made public at a critical moment. Delegates from the Syrian government and opposition were gathering in Switzerland for a long-awaited peace talk. The goal was to negotiate an end to nearly 3 years of devastating civil war. However, the release of the photos overshadowed the talks. They became undeniable evidence of the Assad regime's atrocities, exposing the industrial-scale killing machine that had been hidden for so long. But the outcome was far from what the victims' families hoped for. Rather than bringing accountability, the photos became a cold, bureaucratic confirmation of death. Instead of any real action against Assad's regime, families of the deceased were shown images of their dead loved ones and were used as a way to issue death certificates. It's important to remember that Caesar only documented a fraction of the regime's atrocities, just a few years before he fled Syria. And now the government was overthrown just a week ago, and even now, the prison was packed with thousands of prisoners. To be honest, there is no way of even putting an estimate to the total number of deaths. What we do know is that the world has not seen such a systematic, state-sponsored killing machine since the Nuremberg trials, which uncovered the Nazi regime's industrial genocide during World War II. Apart from Assad's regime, there's Vladimir Putin, sending thousands of soldiers to die every day in the meat grinder on Ukraine's front lines. Then there's Kim Jong-un, whose cruelty needs no introduction. But what's shocking is Syria is far worse than both of them, and yet most of us barely heard about it. This is mainly because Russia has tried to protect the Assad regime in as many ways possible, even to the extent of using its veto power in the United Nations Security Council to shield him from war crimes allegations being referred to the International Criminal Court. This is why evidence like Caesar's photographs became so critical. If any of the victims in those images were identified as Syrians holding dual citizenship, then it would allow that other government to pursue through their own legal systems. But what does Russia gain from all this? To understand this better, we need to look at history. You see, the relationship between Syria and Russia has deep historical roots that date back to the Cold War era. Back then, Syria was one of the Soviet Union's key allies in the Middle East. The Soviets gave Syria weapons, military training, and economic support to counter the US influence in the region. That bond didn't vanish when the Soviet Union fell apart. Russia inherited these ties, and Syria remained a critical partner for Moscow. This relationship gave Russia a military foothold in the Middle East, including access to the Tartus naval base, its only naval base in the Mediterranean. Losing Syria would mean losing that access, which is vital for Russia's global military strategy. So when the Syrian civil war started in 2011, many countries, especially in the West, supported the opposition forces fighting against Bashar al-Assad. But Russia saw things differently. For Moscow, Assad was a stable ally, and keeping him in power meant keeping their influence in the region. They also saw the opposition as fragmented and full of extremist groups, which Russia did not want to see in power. Supporting Assad, from their perspective, was about maintaining stability and avoiding chaos, even if it came at the cost of backing a brutal regime. Like Iraq, Syria is deeply fractured. Years of war left the country broken in spirit and structure. In such conditions, forming organized political parties or democratic institutions is nearly impossible. So, instead, people gravitate towards their ethnic identities. This is why, for a brief period of time, terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS gained footholds in certain areas of Syria. This gave Putin a reason to officially enter Syria in the name of fighting terrorism. In 2015, Russia literally used its own forces and launched a military intervention, and conducted airstrikes, supplied weapons, and deployed military advisors. While they did strike some extremist factions, Russia also bombed civilian areas and territories controlled by moderate rebels. This way, Russia secured its military bases in Syria, including Tartus and the newly built Khmemim airbase. These facilities solidified Russia's presence in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, allowing them to project power far beyond their borders. But now, the fate of these bases hangs in the balance. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has stated that rebel forces have guaranteed the base's security for now. However, there's no indication of any long-term agreement or discussions about their future. Also, when Russia intervened militarily in Syria in 2015, it aimed to secure its influence and establish itself as a major power in the Middle East. This forced regional players like Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia to take Russia's role into account. But Putin's gamble has hilariously backfired. The fall of Assad's regime highlights Russia's limitations as an ally. The failure to provide dependable support will likely make Syria another example of why nations cannot trust Russia to stand by them in critical moments. Now, the Kremlin will likely seek to suck up to the rebel forces and negotiate a deal to preserve its strategic foothold, because those bases are strategically more important and extremely hard to replace. But reaching an agreement won't be easy. The HTS rebels, now Syria's new rulers, are likely to impose harsh conditions on any negotiations. One political demand could be the extradition of Bashar al-Assad back to Syria. Assad, who fled the country and is now seeking asylum in Moscow. Now that the civil war has finally ended, Syria's future remains uncertain. What is certain, however, is that the hardest work lies ahead for its people. The opposition forces, both within and outside of the country, have gained some experience in governance over the years. But they still lack the unity and coordination needed to govern together effectively. So, Mohammed al-Bashir has been appointed as Syria's interim prime minister. His term is set to last until March 1st of 2025, giving Syrians a temporary framework to begin rebuilding their fractured nation. Also, it's no doubt that the leader of the HTS, Abdul Mohammed al-Jalani, is set to play a critical role in Syria's future. There is very little info about his childhood, and what we know is that his life took a significant turn in 2003 when he moved to Iraq during the US invasion. There, Jalani joined Al-Qaeda to resist the American forces. 3 years later, in 2006, he was arrested and imprisoned at Camp Bucca. At this place, he met Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who would later lead the Islamic State. By 2011, Baghdadi sent Jalani back to Syria to establish the Al-Nusra Front, an al-Qaeda-affiliated group aimed at capitalizing on the chaos of the Syrian civil war. Within just a year, the al-Nusra Front became one of Syria's most powerful rebel factions. Seeing this level of traction, Baghdadi announced that he planned to expand the Islamic State into Syria and form what would have become the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, aka ISIL. However, Jalani didn't share the same idea and instead pledged his loyalty to al-Qaeda and started focusing solely on the issues in Syria. Seeing no progress, Jalani decided to sever all ties and rebranded his rebel group as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. According to him, this group only had one goal, and that was to oust Bashar al-Assad and establish control over Syria. This resonated with many, and soon enough, HTS went on to capture significant parts of Syria. Since 2017, HTS has remained the most powerful rebel force and led many operations that eventually resulted in the downfall of Assad's regime. Despite taking control of Syria, the HTS remains a designated terrorist organization in many countries due to its past ties to al-Qaeda. Abu Muhammad al-Jalani has a $10 million bounty on his head for information leading to his capture. But as previously mentioned, Syria has huge strategic importance, making it a key region that everyone wants a piece of. If HTS solidifies its power, most nations will seek to establish relations with it. But that cannot happen while HTS remains on the international terror list. In fact, the UK is reportedly considering removing HTS from its list of designated terrorist organizations. If this happens, HTS could follow the trajectory of the Taliban, transitioning from a militant group to a political force. For now, no one knows what lies ahead for Syria. The future is unclear, and the road will be long and difficult. But for the first time in years, there is a glimmer of hope that ordinary people might finally be safe from the horrors they have endured. The real test now is for the rebels. They must prove that they can be better than the leaders who brought so much suffering. They must give Syria a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to let its people live lives of dignity and peace. After all, everyone deserves a future where they can simply live, free from fear, as every human being should.